It's my pleasure and my honor to be here kicking off the very first session of this wonderful day to recognize the James Jackson Distinguished Career Award for Diversity Scholarship honoring Dr. Robert Sellers. So let me be the first to congratulate Robin. We can Rob was the first person that I met in graduate school, and he's one of my very oldest friends. And that just makes the experience of standing here before you today even more meaningful. And I know that everyone in this room has some kind of connection to Rob that's probably equally meaningful. And I just feel the loving community in the room today, and I know we're gonna have a whole day of that. So thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing this opportunity to honor Rob and all that he's done for all of us. So I am introducing this panel. The title of this is Continuing the Legacy, the Lasting Impact of Dr. Robert Sellers' Contribution in Psychology and Beyond. And I want to say just a very short set of remarks to set this up. You know, everyone in this room, I'm sure, is aware that we are in the midst of an intense national controversy about the value and even the legitimacy of work for diversity, equity, and inclusion in higher education and beyond. For many of us who are kind of at the front line of that controversy, these can be trying times. And because of that, I am so grateful for this opportunity to recognize someone who has devoted his whole career to this work, and may I say his long career to this work, because it reminds us that this is a long game, and it's a game that is accomplished through the work of generations. John Lewis said, "This is the struggle of a lifetime," and many lifetimes, right? And I feel like this panel really demonstrates that, because we're going to take this moment to look at the generations of scholars, teachers, and administrators that Rob has mentored, that his work has made possible, to continue this work, to take it in new directions, to extend its reach, and that's really how this game is won. So this panel demonstrates that, and I want to take a moment to say we're not only here to honor the work that Rob has done, but we're also here to honor the work of James Jackson. And we'll be talking about him throughout the day, but to set up this particular panel on research, I want to tell you, probably most people are aware, that prior to James Jackson's work, really the overwhelming majority of research in social psychology that even looked at African Americans mainly took a comparative approach in which African Americans' experiences were compared to those of white individuals. James really kind of turned the tables on that by turning our attention to the importance and richness of studying within group variation among African Americans. And I would say that he was one of the foundational people that turned our field in that direction, and that Rob was someone that he passed the ball to and who carried it many yards down the field, and you'll see that through the work of his scholars today. So Rob's work continues in that tradition through the groundbreaking work of those he's mentored, and we'll get to hear from 7 of them today. So let me tell you about the logistics for the panel, and then without further ado, get on with it. So each of our panelists will talk for about 7 minutes. Catalina's gonna be our timekeeper. We're gonna hold questions so we make sure we have time to hear from everyone. I'm sure this group has great questions, so write them down. We will have almost an hour afterward to talk about your questions. I hope the panelists will also engage each other and ask each other questions. And then I'll say a few words just to kind of summarize and close us out, and then we will go to lunch. So without further ado, I'm gonna ask each panelist to introduce themselves, because if I introduce them all right now, I'm sure you wouldn't remember. But I will turn the podium over to Dr. Mia Smith-Bynum.
Good morning. Good morning. I feel like this is church, and I feel like saying, "Let the church say Amen." I am Robert Seller's student, after all, and who's a child of a pastor. So, everybody who knows me well know that I like to talk. So, I'm going to be respectful and do this the way my amazing mentor trained me, and I'm going to keep time. So I'm going to set my Apple Watch for 5 minutes so I know my mark, so I can hear from all of my other amazing colleagues, because y'all know I could be up here for an hour, but I don't have it. So I am going to talk about the work that I've been doing pretty much the length of my career as a professor, starting in 2001. This presentation is also a celebration of what we call slow science. In this world that we live in, there's a heavy emphasis on volume of presentations. How many first author papers? What are the rankings, the H factor, the this, the that? Well, I didn't do it that way. Goodness knows if I was a 2001 professor again, I might not have chosen this path, but I got so far into it that there was nothing that could be done, and I said, well, let me keep going. And fortunately for me, there was a theory that came out of this work called the theory of racial socialization in action. For those of y'all who don't know me, I am Mia Smith-Bynum. I'm a professor and chair of the Department of Family Science at the University of Maryland. And I'm going to start this presentation off with a video. And I'm going to ask you in the audience, what would you do if you were the parent of a black teenager in a predominantly white school who was a good student, and your child was constantly raising his or her hand or their hand in class to answer questions, and they were constantly ignored by the instructor. And then finally they get a grade on an assignment that they feel is not a fair assessment of their work. And so your child comes home and says, "Mom, this happened to me. What should I do?"
Actually happened in English, not with you, but your sister. And what she did was call me from school. And that's what I would expect you to do. Call me from school. I leave work, I go to school, I go to the dean's office or the principal's office and ask to set up a meeting with the teacher. I get all the information from you, I get all the papers, and I look it over to make sure, we have a valid thing where we're not just throwing in. And again, I don't go in it as a racism thing. I just go as another grade, because throwing a race card out is just not necessary, because you're already in a school where everybody knows that it's only a handful of blacks. So throwing that race card, that's just not it. And I would sit down with her and with you at the same time, and we look at the paper. And like you said, I would want her to point out to me, show me the syllabus. Okay, what did you do wrong in this paper? And then if she showed me some things, then after she showed me that with you, then I'd sit down and ask her, okay, what can we do to make this paper better? And then I would have you submitted whether you get a grade for it or not, just to see what she thought of it, if you had the ability. And then after that, if I was not satisfied with her, then I would meet with the dean.
Okay. So what you just witnessed there is the first construct that I discovered in my effort to follow in the footsteps of the great Diane Hughes, who created the landmark theory of parental racial socialization. And the parts of her theory that hadn't really been explored at this time, this is 2001, this is one of the very first families that I interviewed who gave me permission to test my observational tool out, were those process-oriented elements. It's direct, it's indirect, it's spontaneous. Like all of those pieces, I was like, we got to get this on video to be able to understand what we're missing.
Actually happened.
Let me see here.
In English, not with you, but your sister. And actually happened. Yeah, in English.
All right, this is not my laptop. Where's the slide advance? Is that there? Is that it there?
And that's what I would expect you to do.
Thank you. I think it's down there. I think that little tiny arrow. I've never seen an advance like that. This must be some newfangled 2024 stuff. At any rate, let me move on. So I created this observational tool where we developed 5 vignettes based on the research on racial discrimination at the time. This was in like circa 2000, 2001. There weren't that many self-report measures for the youngins in the room. Like those didn't really come online to the mid-90s. And so we went through the literature and created these vignettes. This one was called The Teacher. And the paradigm involved 5-minute dyadic discussions between parents and teens. I actually had a lot of fathers in my early pilot data. And we asked them, pretend as if this happened to you. And then to make a long story short, or longer, we ended up discovering all of these new constructs that I won't go into detail. Luckily, due to my academic doula, Dawn Witherspoon, who supported me while I produced a book chapter describing this work. These are all the constructs that I discovered because I watched a critical mass of Black teenagers and parents talking about these dilemmas. We talked about the racist school counselor who said, you people can't do high school level work. How could you ever do college level work, right? Playing soccer and how Black people don't play soccer. Like these are the contexts of the vignettes. These are microaggressions that kids see and experience every day. We even have one about the police. And so the work fell into about 3 categories: parent and adolescent reactions to the event, parental strategies for coping with discrimination, and then adolescent strategies for coping with discrimination. The work was funded by the National Institutes of Mental Health, and it took really the better part of a decade plus to get the published work out. And so, moving on quickly. And so this part, Robert, this is for you. When I was writing this theory and really giving academic birth to it, I was having to work my mind and take it back to the biopsych library where we started the work on the MMRI and the MEB. And I wrote the tenets, and what Robert would say is the assumptions. What are the assumptions about racial identity? And I was like, yeah. And so when I was writing this, I was like, what are we trying to say is real about the dyadic process between parents and Black children when they're raising their kids? And the first thing that came to my mind, I took it to the developmental psych arena, and I thought, the parent is the first teacher. Racial socialization is a social learning process. So when you bring those kids into the world, or you adopt those kids, or however those kids come to be yours, you are making decisions about their racial socialization. Where are you going to live? Where are they going to school? What kind of preschool? What kinds of books do you have in the house? I got to visit Tabby and Robert's home yesterday for the first time. I saw these Black art and luminaries. Like, that's racial socialization, right? And that parents vary in how good or not so good they are at this. So you see this on these videos, and you see not only the variations in the messages about how to cope with these various issues, but also whether or not they get along with their kids. And this stuff you can have brilliant things to share with your kids. If you don't get along with them, if they're alienated, it's not going in. And that's something we were not really talking about. And so what I tried to do in this theory is capture those dynamics, the perspective that the parents are bringing, and we're starting to see this work now in greater volume, the perspective that the kids are not tabula rasas. You know, I remember this was before the election of President Obama, and some of my kids were like, racism doesn't exist. Be interesting to see if somebody repeat that paradigm today, because it does very much. And then also, through a collaboration with my colleagues at the University of Georgia, they repeated my paradigm, which was with high school age kids, with younger kids, like late childhood, early adolescence. And parts of the theory came into focus by seeing those parents work to teach those kids as well. And so the kid's temperament, their capacity to grasp what was being shared, that you, and then also, I was just gonna say, the goodness of fit. So there's some parents and kids, they just are like, and you see that connection. I don't know if she's here, but Sierra Smalls, her work, she was one of the few to do it with the self-report on the racial socialization and the parenting. And so that was part of the foundation of how I saw this, and then looking at the UGA data with my colleagues there. And so I want to be respectful, because I'm not going to go all the way to the end, but there are publications if you want to see them. Here is a schematic of what I think is happening at the broad level. You can think about this from Vygotsky's take. So if you look at that red zone, that's what the kid can master without the support of their parents. Like, it's that zone of proximal learning. And then if you look at my Maryland themed boxes, no disrespect to the big M, you know, there's another big M out there. So with the red here, they're able to master racial coping without the help from others in that red zone. In the center, if that parent is skilled and connected to that child, you can expand what that child is able to do when it comes to racial coping, because that's ultimately what we're trying to do, is to help that young person make as best a decision as they can in a split section, and sometimes under threat. And then the yellow box is like what that kid can't do without the support of their parents. And so they're just not there yet. That's human development. And as I was sitting there, so I was able to see that with the UGA data, because those little kids, they were like, why are they not being nice to them? Like the sweet little 9-year-olds talking about bias, but not understanding. And you could see the parents' wheels turning like, how do I say this in a way that my 9-year-old can grasp? And so, and I could map that across the different stages of adolescence. So I'm going to, I got a minute. So let me see, that's more than I expected. And so, because I know I'm not going to get to the end, because I really don't want to take other people's time. This, as I mentioned, this work was supported by the National Institutes of Mental Health, and then some wonderful colleagues at the Recreation Center for the City of Indianapolis, where I collected my first round of pilot data. So here is the theory. So now y'all know why I could be up here for an hour, but I don't have the time. But I don't know. Let me turn around so I can walk out through this slide and look at y'all at the same time. So as you can see, shout out to the right hand of the slide. That's my racial identity roots right there. And I was trying to figure out how to put this all together. So we know from path A at the bottom that racial discrimination obviously undermines Black kids' mental health. But here in the dotted oval are the pieces that I've been trying to capture, this goodness of fit. Understanding that your kid may be highly anxious. My son Malcolm was one of my pilot test subjects when I told him that the media were being racist against President Obama because he was Black, and watching him burst into tears. And I was like, okay, temperament. Temperament is a part of racial socialization. And then sensitivity, empathy, parental behavior, the old school parenting, the Steinberg, the work, and then my observed constructs, all shaping and moderating or mediating child racial identity and kids' outcomes. And so that's it in a nutshell. I'm gonna take my seat, but I wanna absolutely say it's an honor to be here. I'm honored to have been selected in the panel. It's a great privilege, and I hope you heard something useful amidst all of my attempts at jokes, and I am gonna take my seat. Thank y'all.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to start off by saying thank you, Rob, and congratulations. Thank you for all that you've done to kind of support me over the years. I just think back to all the times where we would be in your office and you would basically fight me over my ideas. And I'm still not convinced that you believe in what I do, but I really do appreciate you pushing me and saying like, I don't know. You always had like a healthy distrust of some of my ideas. Which is what you need. You need an advisor who will push you. And I also wanted to quickly say thank you for letting me do a lot of my own thing. Like I have students now, and I'm like, this is a lot of work to have to mentor somebody who's doing things I don't really have the desire or the background to do. So I mean, I appreciate you for doing that because that's a lot of extra work on your part. So thank you. And I want to just thank whoever invited me to be here to give this talk. I don't know why you picked me in particular. My research doesn't necessarily relate to what Rob does, but I'm going to try to tie it in at the end. So let's see how that goes. So my name is Darrell Wout. I am a professor at John Jay College, City University of New York. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the power of friends, how friendship diversity can create identity safety. So some of the formatting is a little off from what I sent, but I'll work with it. So a study of white people's friendship networks found that 75% of white people, yeah, this is formatting's all off, have only white friends. Similarly, that study found that for black people, 65% of them have only black friends. So in many ways, you have white people and black people living in two different worlds, oftentimes with two different realities. And there's a growing body of research that I think Rob, again, doesn't necessarily buy into, but I'm going to try to convince you a little bit more today, that looks at a factor that might influence why there is this lack of friendship across groups. And I'm going to focus on race. I'm going to get a little bit into politics if I have time. And it's social identity threat. And it's the idea that it's the anticipation of being perceived negatively or stereotypically, and it's also this anticipation of being devalued or mistrusted by whoever is in your particular context, right? And one of the main arguments for this particular theory is that people are very attuned to contexts in which they think they're going to be devalued or stereotyped or viewed negatively. So they're looking for cues that will signal whether or not that's likely to happen or it's not, right? So if they're concerned that it's going to happen, then they have to prepare themselves psychologically to kind of contend with that possibility. Whereas if they think it's a low possibility of being devalued or stereotyped, then they can relax and just be more themselves, right? So people are constantly looking for contextual cues that are signals of safety or of threat. And by nature, intergroup interactions tend to be ones that are threatening, right? You're more likely to be concerned about how you're going to be perceived and treated by out-group members than by in-group members. So one of the arguments is that there has to be cues in that environment that signal to people that you're unlikely to be devalued or stereotyped. And again, I apologize for the formatting. Things got a little wonky here. One of the things that I argue, based upon my own personal experience and observation, is that one meaningful cue are the people in that person's friends. So if you're interacting with a person of an out group, the more diverse their friends, the more you're likely to feel safe. And in particular, the more you see that person that's friends of your particular group, the less you're going to be concerned about being devalued or stereotyped. Oh boy. All this formatting is off, so again, I apologize. So to test the idea, we had black participants come in and they were told they're going to interact with the white person, the same gender white person. And they were also provided information about that person's friends. So for some of them, they were told that this person has all white friends, right? Again, which we know from the beginning of the talk, that's pretty much typical for white people. But then another condition, they were told this person has white and black friends. So in the all-white condition, they had 5 white friends, and in the white and black condition, they had 3 white friends and 2 black friends. And then as this third condition, they were told about this person, but they weren't given information about their friends. The friends' race information was removed from that particular context. And what we found is that when the person thought they were interacting with the white person who had a diverse set of friends, they expected to be perceived as being warmer and as being more competent versus in the other two conditions. And in replications, we found that when the person had a diverse set of friends, they also were more interested in befriending that person, and they anticipated fewer challenges when having a topic about racial profiling, right? So there's the context, basically, this person having a diverse set of friends seemed to signal to people that they were unlikely to be stereotyped or devalued, and therefore they were much more open to going into this interaction in a more positive way. But the question that always came back to me was like, what, do you have to have diversity? Does this person have to have diversity that you see yourself represented? So if I'm a black person interacting with a white person, do I have to have that, does that person have to have black friends for me to feel like I'm not going to be devalued or stereotyped? And so to kind of get to the question of like, how do people interpret diversity? So decided to run another study. We're going to have black participants, and again, interacting with the white person. And again, this person either had 5 white friends, or they had, again, 3 white friends, 2 black friends, and I'm gonna now label this as diversity with representation. Or they had 3 white friends, then 1 Asian American friend, and 1 Latinx friend. And we're gonna describe that as diversity without representation. So now you can kind of get a sense of, do I have to see myself represented, or just like, is diversity enough, right? And then, so first we want to look at was, what was our perceptions of the diversity of this person's friendship network? And what we found is that when participants saw their race represented, they perceived that person's friendship network as being the most diverse. And just to kind of make this simple across the rest of these slides that I'm presenting for this particular talk, all these conditions are different from each other for every dependent variable. So that they thought that the person with diverse set of friends, where their group was represented, was the most diverse, followed by if there was diversity without representation, and then they thought that obviously the all-white friends was the least diverse, right? Similarly, when we looked at like black stereotypes, when participants saw that their race was represented, they thought that person was going to view them less stereotypically, followed by when the person had diversity without representation, but then when they had all white friends, that's the context where they thought they were going to be viewed the most stereotypically black. So these are like, lazy, aggressive, these kind of stereotypical black stereotypes. And then in regards to how challenging they thought the interaction was going to be, they thought it was going to be the least challenging when they saw their race represented, followed by when there was diversity without representation, and then they thought that when the person had all white friends, that it was going to be the most challenging. So collectively, this kind of highlights that diversity by itself is helpful, but it's also nice to see diversity where your group is represented. So at minimum, try to have diversity in your friendship networks, but it's even better if you can see yourself represented, because that kind of signals to you, this person must value my group, and therefore they're going to value me, and they're going to treat me and view me more positively. I know I'm short on time, so I'm going to now kind of quickly pivot. I've been very obsessed about the election. So I was curious about, can we find similar effects when we looked at this in terms of interpolitical interactions? Because what you find is that only 9% of Democrats have a lot of conservative friends, and only 14% of conservatives have a lot of friends that are Democrats. So just like race, you see this, there's this big divide between the groups, right? So there's this chasm here. Can we use friendship networks to kind of create a context where people are going to feel safer in that particular context? All my formatting is all messed up here. I did a lot of work to get the formatting right, and I'm like, So we had liberal participants, and they had a conservative partner, and that partner either had 6 conservative friends or 3 liberal friends and 3 conservative friends. And similarly, we had conservative participants. They had a liberal partner who had 6 liberal friends or 3 liberal and 3 conservative friends, right? So very simple setup. And again, to make things simple, for these particular set of findings, all you're going to see is the main effect for the manipulation of friendship network. So when the partner had a diverse set of friends, regardless of the political ideology of the participant, they felt like they were going to be perceived as warmer or more competent than when the partner had homogenous friends. Similarly, they were more interested in befriending their partner if that partner had a diverse set of friends versus an homogenous set of friends. And they anticipated fewer challenges when that person had a diverse set of friends versus a homogenous set of friends. And what I liked in this one is like they also were more willing to compromise. We're having a conversation about, they gave a list of like politically challenging topics that they're going to have to discuss. And what we found is that they were more willing to compromise if their partner had a diverse set of friends versus a homogenous set of friends. And the one variable that I didn't report, but I should have, because I was worried about time, is that they also were less likely to humanize their partner when their partner had diverse set of friends versus a homogenous set of friends. So in some ways, you can see that like having interactions when your partner has some level of diversity, be it your group is represented or at least diversity on some level in regards to race, political ideology, it creates an environment where people feel safer, and it should, in theory, and I haven't tested it yet, should create context where these interactions will be more positive, more constructive, and that hopefully through those positive, constructive interactions, people will start to develop more cross-group friendships. Now, I promise you that I would try to find a way to tie this back in. Rob, it's a little, I admit it's a little weak. I'm not gonna lie, it's a little weak. But I do think this, in some ways, speaks to the importance of Rob's work and Natabi's work trying to ensure that Michigan stays as one of the leaders in terms of like encouraging and creating diverse college settings for our students and having a diverse faculty, right? So by having this diversity, it enables these potential interactions so that people can now start to like engage with each other and have these kind of difficult conversations that we need to have if we're gonna grow and develop. So I want to commend Rob and Michigan for really putting themselves out there. And there's a lot of backlash these days, but I still believe strongly that you guys are doing the right thing. And I really appreciate that we have you and Tabby kind of taking the helm and making sure that Michigan in particular is in the forefront of all this work. So thank you.
Oh, I see. Okay. Okay. Okay, Daryl, I see what you're saying about the formatting. I didn't see it from over there, but now I see it from over here. But we're gonna go with it. Thank you all. It's a pleasure to be here today with you. And I'll just note that this is a PC, and I'll come back to why that's relevant at the end of my talk, but this is a PC, so I'm just putting it out there. Some of you know what this is referring to. Okay, so I won't repeat the title of the talk, but I will sort of tease the end of the talk, which is the contributions of Rob's legacy beyond psychology. So today I'm going to talk about how he's impacted my scholarship within the field of psychology, but I'm also going to tease something at the end, which goes beyond our academic walls. So I'm Tiffany Yip. I'm a professor of psychology at Fordham University, and I was here at Michigan for 2 years. Between 2003 and 2005, and I came here to work with Rob sort of out of coincidence, I would say. So I was, finishing my degree at NYU and sort of not really sure what I wanted to do. So I was having a conversation with Ed Seidman, who was not my primary mentor, but who was a professor at NYU. And he said, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "I'm not really sure. I don't know if academia is right for me." And I said, "But if I were to do a postdoc, the only person I'd do it with is Rob." And before I knew it, I was emailing Rob somehow. I don't know how that happened. And we wrote a proposal together and got some money, and then I ended up here. So that's how I came here. So I was thinking about, how to illustrate the impact of Rob's scholarship on my own work. And so one way that I thought, I'm very visual, one way I thought about doing that is taking the publications that I've had the privilege of working on with my students and with many people in this room, and Rob included, and throwing it into a word cloud. And if you can see here, this is a very sort of, I think, elegant depiction of the impact of his scholarship on my work. So this is literally taking all the publications and throwing it into word cloud. But I'm also going to talk more specifically about two areas in which Rob has impacted my work. One is sort of the conceptualization of the MMRI, which I'm not going to go into. I think all of us are familiar, but in particular the notion of salience, right? So the idea that the relevance of your identity moves across situations, moves across time, moves across days, and then how that relates to the development of racial ethnic identity over time. So how we operationalized this idea of salience is either sort of daily or across situations. We would prompt young people, so these are diverse young kids in New York City, and we would ask them the extent to which they felt like a member of their racial ethnic group on a particular day or at a particular moment in time. So we did some experience sampling where we would randomly page young people several times a day. And what you see here are the interclass correlations, and all they tell us is that, in fact, identity does move, right? So if we look at our adolescent samples, we see that about 2/3 of the movement, right, or the endorsement of salience is something about the adolescent, something stable or characteristic of the adolescent. And about 25% is something that's much more fluid, much more dynamic, much more a product of what that person is experiencing at the situation level or at the daily level. So we see elements of stability in identity, and we see elements of movement. In our young adult samples, we see similar sort of distributions, except that maybe for young adults, it seems like there may be a little bit more fluidity, a little bit more movement and salience than there is stability. And so in our work, we tried to sort of think, like, what predicts how identity moves up and down across moments of days and time, or what does that predict, right? So looking at both the consequences and predictor, and I won't go into much of this today, only to say that we've looked at a lot of things, a lot of features of the context, features of the adolescent that predict movement and identity salience, as well as some of the mental health consequences. But I did want to highlight one particular study today with you, and this is a study I did with 2 former students, where we look at sort of this variability in identity salience, how it moves across time and space, and how it's related to identity development over time. So here we have a graph looking at, this is our situation level data. So we're prompting young people at the level of situation several times a day about their salience. So asking, how relevant is your race ethnicity to you right now? And so across, so we have both sort of mean levels, so on average how kids are reporting on this, and this is sort of a 7-point Likert scale. But we also look at variability, so movement across situations and time. And that's what we have on the x-axis, is sort of, is there a lot of movement across these situations in responses to salience, or maybe is there not a lot? So we have low levels of salience across time, variability, and high levels of variability over time. And the lines depict sort of the average levels. And so we're looking at identity exploration as an outcome. So this is a longitudinal looking 6 months later, to what extent are these adolescents telling us that they're actively exploring their ethnic racial identity? And what we found was, the blue line, that adolescents who reported lower mean levels of salience, so on average, they're not really thinking about their race that much. But the ones who have high variability, so sometimes they're thinking about it a lot, sometimes they're not thinking about it much at all. But the adolescents who are moving up and down a lot, those are the ones that are telling us 6 months later that they are really actively exploring their identity, relative to adolescents who are basically not in that category. So ones who have higher average salience or who have low variability. So it's really this situation level experience of not thinking about it that much on average, but having a lot of movement over their daily life experiences. When you throw centrality into the mix, so centrality is really sort of the extent to which race is a defining feature of your identity. I'll still call your attention to the two solid lines, and what I've done here is taking the solid line that I showed you in the previous graph and broken it down into high centrality and low centrality. So if you look at the blue solid line, you'll see what's happening is that adolescents who are saying race is important to me, these are high race central adolescents. They, in particular, are the ones that are saying, that are exploring their identities if they have these low average levels and high variability. So centrality matters, right? If race matters to these adolescents, they are more likely to see this impact of sort of average levels, variability, and sort of exploration over time. So far, these are just mean levels. And here's a graph that depicts development over time. So here on the x-axis, instead of variability, we have just change in time. So wave 1 versus wave 2. And what you see here is that, again, these adolescents who report low mean levels, high variability, they actually report a significant increase in identity exploration. So it's not just that they have higher levels than other adolescents, it's that their levels of exploration are increasing. So they're thinking about their identity, if they're actively exploring it, much more related to these sort of daily situation level sort of variations, right, in their identity. So here's the teasing of the beyond. Those of you, or many of you here are mentees of Rob. So these are the nuggets of wisdom that Rob would share with me in his office that I continue to pass on to my students. 1, no one is going to tenure your hard drive. Has anyone heard that? So now I update it because no one has hard drives. So it's like Google Drive, OneDrive, but you get the point, right? Is that you can't have papers sitting on your computer. You need to get them out in the world. Some of you may have heard these same nuggets. Make sure your CV can get you to your next job, right? So thinking, oh, I see some nodding. Okay. So, yep, this is also one that I passed down. This is a favorite. Being on the job market is a lot like dating. The more offers you have, the more attractive you become. Are there any nods? I see some more nods. Okay, I see some more nods. And here's the reason why I had to talk about this is a PC. And I did move to Mac, so that's why this formatting's off. And I will just end that all of you know, that Rob's impact is well beyond the academy and our professional lives. Here's a picture of Rob with my 2 girls. Taken in 2013. This was the APA conference. We stayed a couple days after the conference, hung out at the beach, and spent time with my girls. So this was in 2013, so well beyond professional impact. So thank you, Rob, and I'm so honored to be here to celebrate you.
Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here to celebrate Rob today. My name is Gabe Coopermink, and I am a professor of psychology and public health at Georgia State University. And I'm so glad I got to go after Tiffany because one of the very first lessons that I learned from Rob is that it's okay to be a Mac person in a PC world. So if I have some formatting troubles here, there you go. So I just want to take a minute to look at my title and just that little piece of a quote, our similarities are different. When Yogi Berra, the famous Yogi Berra's son, got into Major League Baseball, a reporter asked him to compare himself to his father. And Dale Barra's response was, "You can't compare me to my father. Our similarities are different." So I think I'll come back to that. So the first lesson that I wanted to talk about, and I already did a little bit, is that sports analogies can help explain pretty much anything. I do want to get a little bit into it, just touch on a few research findings that focus on some of the work that I took on after leaving graduate school. If you want to understand a cultural, racial, or ethnic group, it really requires exploring heterogeneity beyond being open to unexpected findings. So always question the assumptions, always question what everybody thinks they know, and see if it really works that way. And the last one is being open to learning with and from students and community partners. So before I leave that, I wanted to point out April 4th, 1974 was a really important date related to my development as a PhD psychologist. And the reason that's an important date is that about 30 years later, the night before my dissertation defense, I was up half the night. Most people can probably relate to that idea of being up half the night before. And I felt pretty good about my rationale. I felt pretty good about my analysis. Felt pretty good about the interpretations and the conclusions. What I was nervous about was sports trivia. And I was just reading up everything I could, and I knew I was a big Atlanta Braves fan, and I knew there was going to be something in that dissertation defense about the Atlanta Braves. I didn't know what it was, but I read everything that I could about the Atlanta Braves half the night. So April 4th, 1974, do you know where I'm going, Rob? Jack Billingsley of the Cincinnati Reds in the stadium in Cincinnati there, he threw a pitch that Hank Aaron knocked over the fence for his 714th home run, tying Babe Ruth's record. And it was 4 days later, I think it was in LA, he hit number 715. I had studied number 715. And this question has stuck with me now for 30 years. And I finally got the answer right. Okay.
4-4.
What's that?
4-4.
Yeah.
April 4th.
April 4th. There you go. All right. So culture. You know, I think when I started graduate school, I hadn't been really exposed very much to work on race and ethnicity and things along those lines. And in fact, the work that I was doing with Rob in graduate school focused on some work with a big data set from the NCAA. And it was before he started bringing in this amazing group of people to develop the MMRI and the MIBI. And I just remember a lot of conversations that Rob and I had in his office talking about ethnicity, talking about race and culture and the distinctions between those. And I think one of the things I took away from all of that was just that these are legitimate questions to ask. These are real things that we should be studying. And that was just something that I hadn't been exposed to before, and I think it really kind of freed me and gave me permission to say, hey, I can study these things that really matter to me. I'm the son of immigrants from Argentina, so I grew up kind of being that kid who sort of looked the same as a lot of the ones who were around me, but I spoke Spanish and ate weird foods and things along those lines. So I had all of those questions floating, but didn't learn until some point in graduate school that it was legitimate to study this stuff and to really try to understand it. So when we look at culture, these are some of the things that we study. And getting back to my title, I think one of the things that I've learned from that is that I went into studying culture thinking, oh, I'm going to find all these differences, and it's going to really explain so much of the things that I'm trying to understand in life. And what I found was that more often than not, the constructs that we measure are pretty similar across a pretty wide range of cultural groups. The values, the relationships, things like that. If you look at the constructs, they hold up pretty well across a pretty wide group. But where the differences often lie are in the importance we place on them, and the meaning that they hold for other aspects of our lives, and so on. And so after grad school, I got to work on a study in a middle school about stress and depression, and we were looking at processes of self-development, things like self-efficacy, self-concept, things like that, and also processes around relationships with peers, relationships with parents. And I did a study, a comparative study, looking at Black, Latino, and white middle school students, and found something pretty interesting, which was that over time, it was a two-wave longitudinal study, that Latinx and Black kids who had experienced some threat in their relationships, either with peers or parents, they were experiencing more, that was more strongly related to their mental health a year later. For white adolescents, it was the experiences of self, so problems in self-efficacy and self-concept that were affecting their mental health a year later. So similar processes. If you look at the graphs, they all went in pretty much the same direction, but it was more pronounced for relationships for the Latino and Black kids, and more pronounced for so similar processes, but the similarities were different. Problem I had with that study was it was a comparative study. It told me something interesting, but I didn't have any more data to look into why that might be the case, what was going on. Touch on one, just a couple other studies. One that I turned to doing studies within Latino youth, and finding that they had a lot of responsibilities in their families. A lot of us have chores growing up, right? So the chores are a pretty similar thing. And a lot of the literature was really pathologizing that so when young people have a lot of responsibilities for cooking, cleaning, caring for younger kids in immigrant families, we're also talking about culture brokering, language brokering, and things like that, was really being pathologized in the literature. And that's not what I was seeing with the kids I was studying. And sure enough, the findings that we had was that those behaviors themselves had very little to do with their mental health, even longitudinally over a year period of time. It was whether those behaviors were sort of consonant with their cultural expectations and beliefs. The behaviors themselves had more to do with increasing social competence, increasing confidence, maturity, and things like that. So again, similar processes, but maybe a little bit different in the way they worked out. I had a couple more to talk about, but I'm running out of time, so I just wanted to end with another little sports quote. Hank Aaron was quoted as saying, "So long as there's a chance maybe I can hammer out a little justice now and then, or a little opportunity here and there, I intend to do as I always have, keep on swinging."
All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Lori Hoggard. I'm an assistant professor of applied social psychology at North Carolina State University. I was formerly on the faculty at Rutgers University, and I am both honored and thrilled to be here to celebrate the outstanding Robert Sellers, who was my PhD advisor here at the University of Michigan from 2008 to 2013. And so I'd like to start out with how my academic journey began. So you may have experienced racial discrimination or witnessed racial discrimination and felt your blood pressure spike or like your heart was about to beat out of your chest. And these were the questions I was interested in understanding and that I'm still interested in understanding. What are African Americans' cardiovascular responses to racism in the moment, but also what are the linkages between chronic racism and cardiovascular disease risk over time? And so when I started out here at Michigan, there were larger daily diary studies that were being conducted, and so we were having African American college students report on any racial discrimination events that they had experienced. So each day, for 20 days, they would report on those experiences and describe them in their own words as well. And so one theme that came across was the theme of criminality. For instance, one participant said, "I was at a high-class shopping strip where the majority of shoppers are white. Out of all the stores we went to, only one sales associate greeted us and offered their help, while at all the other stores, we were watched and followed." Another theme that stood out was being treated as if they are intellectually inferior. And so one thing I was interested in doing was advancing this work by creating these kinds of real-life events in the laboratory context, in a controlled environment, thereby allowing me to assess participants in the moment responses to racism, specifically cardiovascular. We use this approach starting out with my master's thesis. We also use this approach in my dissertation study, which I will describe briefly now. African American participants came into the lab. They witnessed an exchange between an experimenter who was white and a Confederate or an actor. Specifically, they overheard the Confederate say to the experimenter that they, the participant, probably had a low GPA. And so this actor was either black or the actor was white. And we assessed their cardiovascular responses. When the insult happened, up to 16 minutes after the insult happened, participants then went home. They came to the lab again on the next day so that we can continue to assess their cardiovascular responses. They were told what the study was really about, and they had the opportunity to meet this actor who had insulted them. For quick reference, the heart is influenced by both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic branches of the autonomic nervous system. The sympathetic is the fight or flight system, whereas the parasympathetic branch is the faster moving rest and digest system. And so it's measured via heart rate variability, which essentially is the variation in time between heartbeats. Higher heart rate variability is optimal or ideal, whereas lower heart rate variability is not. And so moving on to our findings quickly, we found that our participants who were insulted by the white Confederate or the white actor had lower heart rate variability relative to those who were insulted by the black actor. And this was 11 minutes after the insult happens. We still see this difference 16 minutes after the insult happened. As a reminder, they went home, returned to the lab the next day, and we still see the same difference. So those who were insulted by the white Confederate had lower heart rate variability. And again, this is approximately 24 hours later. So essentially, racism seems to be associated with diminished or reduced heart rate variability shortly after it happens, but also up to 24 hours later. And so I'm now going to pivot to the work that I'm currently conducting and that I've been conducting over the last few years. You may remember when I described the daily diary work that we were conducting when I started out at Michigan, that a theme was criminality. So one thing that I've been focusing on is police-perpetrated racism as it relates to health in African American and Black communities. So my team and I are currently conducting a study in which we're examining police-related stress, so personal experiences with police encounters, being stopped by the police, witnessing police stops, witnessing police brutality via social media or the news, or having experiences that have been relayed by friends, family members, community members, and so forth. We do so for 5 waves of data collection. We're also conducting a 30-day daily diary study, so going back to my roots. We assess their sleep quality and duration, as research shows that sleep duration and sleep quality are risk factors for cardiovascular disease and health more generally. And we are looking at the area level density of police, law enforcement agencies and police agencies, correctional facilities, jails, prisons, and so forth. Some other work that I'm doing that I'm really excited about is in collaboration with Tanae Lewis, who attended University of Michigan for her undergrad. Rob actually introduced me to Tanae Lewis, and we're focusing on police-related stress and exposure among African American women. And what we see preliminarily is that greater experiences or greater police exposure is associated with the stiffening of the arteries, which is a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. I think I'm good on time, but I do want to acknowledge my research collaborators, graduate students, research assistants, and also, of course, Rob Sellers, who taught me how to think, trained me to conduct innovative and scientifically rigorous research, who modeled how to have long-lasting collaborative relationships, and perhaps most importantly, showed me how to be a professor who provides strong mentorship to students and did so with warmth. So thank you, Rob.
All right. Good morning, everyone. It is wonderful to be here. I flew back this morning from Minneapolis, where our annual APHA Public Health Conference is taking place. When I found out that the conference was happening the same time as the celebration for Rob, I said, there's no way I'm missing this, and I had to make sure that I was back here today. So I'm really delighted to be here. It's an honor to be a part of the panel this morning. I have used this image before in some of my other talks, but when I looked at it, I thought, you know what, I'm going to use this again because when I think of Rob Sellers, I think of someone whose giving knows no end, and whose giving has, sort of informed generations and generations of scholarship and important work around diversity scholarship. So thank you, Rob, for that. Over the last 20 years now, I can't believe that, our research program has focused on racism and mental health. My years here at Michigan were formative in thinking about my research program. I started at Penn State. I was interested in stress and coping, but didn't really think about what particular kinds of stress I was interested in. And when I got here, Rob and his team in his lab really helped me to narrow in on racial discrimination in particular. And so a lot of the work that we went on to do was centered around racial discrimination and health. I was also interested in resilience. I came in knowing that was a frame, but hadn't really thought about which specific aspects of resilience were important. And much of my work went on to do or focus on racial identity and racial socialization. These were directly things that I learned and focused on that were part of Rob's research program that shaped my research program. So I share this with you to make the point that my research program without Rob's scholarship and without his laboratory would not be what it is today. One other thing I'll point out before the next slide is that I'm trained as a clinical psychologist, was always interested in mental health. Towards the end of my graduate school career, I started reading a lot of health disparities literature, and I wasn't sure what I wanted to do next. And Rob said, you know, I think one thing you should think about is going to Howard University and working with Jules Harrell. And that expanded, as I'll talk about in just a moment, my thinking about health and thinking about cardiovascular health and psychophysiology as well. So this program has spawned may not be the best word, but a couple of buckets that really have their foundation in the work that Rob trained me in his lab. We have done studies that have looked at a broad range of mental health outcomes, suicide ideation, alcohol-related problems, thinking about internalized racism. But the central thrust of a lot of the work has really been thinking about resilience and vulnerability processes. How does racial identity play a role in this relationship between discrimination and health? And we've expanded that to think about it in the context of cardiovascular outcomes. How does racial socialization play a role? And also some of my students have looked at religious involvement. So that's been another area of interest. Several people have already alluded to Rob's influence in how they think and being pushed in ideas. And so a big bucket of work is really thinking conceptual work, thinking about how do we measure these things, how do we measure racism, how do we measure discrimination. And I also credit Rob and his pushing, his gentle pushing and challenging in our individual meetings with helping me to become a really good thinker in the field. Okay, so I highlighted, I went back and looked at my CV, and I wanted to highlight 3 studies that I'm really proud of and that mean a lot in the context of how Rob trained me. The first paper is back from 2008. This was a paper where we looked at racial socialization as a protective factor in the relationship between discrimination and mental health. The tables here kind of show you that there's a longitudinal relationship between discrimination and changes in psychological adjustment. At the time, there actually were very few longitudinal studies that actually showed a link between discrimination and health. So that was one finding that you see here. But perhaps the most interesting thing about this work was Rob was beginning to think about how do we make sure that the processes that we measure actually reflect the theory. And so there are lots of different ways that people socialize around race. And so we started thinking about profile analyses. And I selected this study because this work went on to inform a lot of the work that I did in the years subsequent and the work that my students did, thinking about profiles of racial identity, profiles of socialization, so on and so forth. 2 other things about this study. First, this was an example of Rob kind of had an idea, we worked on it together as a lab group, but he said, you know what, you're gonna lead this study. At the time I was like, I don't know how to lead a study. But he put his students first. He said, you know, you're gonna be the first author on this, you're gonna write the intro, so on and so forth. And so this study holds meaning for me in that regard. The last thing about it is that in the study we found that these different profiles moderated the link between discrimination and mental health. And we found that there were some profiles, like not talking about race at all, that exacerbated the link between discrimination and mental health. And then there were other profiles involving cultural behaviors that were protective. This study was significant to me because in my clinical work, I had a lot of Black parents who would come in and say to me, I don't know if I should talk to my kids about race. I'm worried that if I do that, it may make them, you know, more upset or cause distress. And subsequent to this study, there were a lot of schools that were saying, oh, we think race colorblind is the way to go. And this was one of the first instances where I was able to say, well, actually, we have data on this that can inform how you think about racial socialization and talking about race in settings. So that large real-world impact was significant. Okay, study 2 that I selected was a study published in Psychophysiology. Does racial centrality moderate physiological reactivity? So all of grad school, we had done these studies looking at racial centrality as a protective factor, extending some earlier work that Rob and many students before had done. I was interested in whether we would find changes in physiological activity as a function of racial identity. I'm not going to go into the specifics of pre-ejection period, which is a measure of sympathetic activation, but what we found in this study at the level of milliseconds is that racial identity moderated how people were responding physiologically. These were racism vignettes, and when these participants imagined vignettes with white actors, you had a very different sort of reaction physiologically. Actually, you got a flight or fight response that you did not get when you had lower levels of centrality or even moderate levels of centrality. And so this was mind-blowing to me for a couple of reasons. One, we had always thought of racial identity as protective, and we still do, and it is. But I had expected that there wouldn't be sympathetic activation, that we would actually see, kind of a modest activation. And in fact, what we saw is that there was this flight or fight response. Again, at the level of milliseconds, and something people were filling out in terms of how central race is to their identity was influencing something that was internal and that they had no conscious control over. Okay, this last one is not a study, it's a model that we published about a year ago, looking at the mechanisms by which different racial protective factors influence the link between racism and mental health. So at the top, level 1, you see all of the different racial and cultural protective factors we looked at over the years, and I tried to catalog all the different mechanisms that people have articulated over the years in terms of how these things lead to changes in racism and mental health. I selected this one because, again, Rob's scholarship has really been instrumental in thinking about what are the mechanisms? How do these things actually work? It's not just enough to document that racial identity is protective or that socialization buffers, but how does it do that? And so I've tried in my work in scholarship to help the field think about ways in which these processes occur. Okay, so current work that we're doing right now, really quickly, happy to talk more about, is community-based participatory research we are doing in Detroit with my partners at Focus Hope. We're looking at job training programs and how they can better mental health outcomes in African American young adults. During COVID, we saw a significant attrition in the job training programs in Detroit at Focus Hope. And Focus Hope said, we really need someone who has expertise in mental health because we provide job vouchers, we provide travel, we provide rental assistance, but folks are not completing the job training programs because of mental health concerns. And so this project is really looking at how do we enhance job training programs, bringing in a mental health component in order to not only, help them finish the programs, but also go to economic justice, economic outcomes that are related to completion of the job training programs. So that's some of the work that we are doing now. I share this with you because one of the things that Rob always taught us in the work that we did was not just to do studies for study's sake, but to think about impact and think about how we could improve and make the communities better for the participants that we work with. And so this is some initial work funded by William T. Grant Foundation in that regard. Okay. This is one of my favorite lab pictures from many years ago. I wanted to end with 2 slides to get us to think about, there's all the research that we've all talked about and that Rob has trained us to do. But for me, some of the greatest impact that Rob has had on my scholarship is the students that I have trained and the lab meetings that we ran. So this is after a lab meeting. My lab meetings had my own, spin on how I was trained, but the kind of family atmosphere that we had was such an instrumental part of what my students experienced when they were students and now are training their students, again, with their own, sort of what they bring to the table. And to me, and I'll end on this slide, these are some of the students I have trained who are now tenured professors, who are own private practice. Some of them are here in the room today. And for me, the impact of Rob's scholarship is not just on the work and scholarship that we have done, but it is on all of these, going back to the generational theme and Rob's giving of himself, all of these folks who are now in their own right, who have long left training with me and are giving to the world. So multi-generational impact, and I feel really fortunate because without Rob and his scholarship and the people who he always credits that came before him, none of these things would have happened. So thank you, Rob.
So at this time, I would like to welcome the panelists back up to the front, and we will have time for Q&A. And I'm told there's someone with a microphone coming around. Okay, great. Shanice will come around with the microphone, or I guess, okay, raise your hand and we will find you. So, and hopefully Elle can see you because the light is right in my eyes.
Hello, my name is Christian, and I have a question for Dr. Smith Bynum. Sorry. So, in the work that you've done, have you accounted for, have you modernized it in the sense of social media and the internet when it comes to socialization? So, what I mean is, how has the internet impacted the youth's ability to socialize their identities when it comes to race and racial things? Thank you.
I'm going to ask you a follow-up question. I'm going to channel Robert and ask you a follow-up. So can you say more about the accounting for social media and racial socialization? So do you mean in terms of the context of the kids' exposure or the parents using social media as a tool for educating kids? A little bit more detail.
I mean, in general, kids' exposure. I know a lot of times parents are not really teaching their kids more often than not. It's you learn about the world through the internet or social media.
Yeah. Okay. So my work hasn't addressed that specifically because a lot of my data come from a period of time before it is what it is right now. But I think that a contemporary parent of a Black child today, like social media is just another developmental arena. You got the schools, you got your neighborhoods, you got places of worship, extracurricular organizations, and social media is just one more. And there are actually some scholars, some of whom may be in this room. The first person that comes to mind is Brendisha Tynes, who's out there in your neck of the woods at University of Southern California. She's really probably the lead scholar when you look at the impact of social media as a space where racial discrimination, exposure to police brutality towards Black and brown folks, like that's really her lane. So I'm very much on the parenting side, and I think the piece that you're getting at is that the parents may not be as savvy when it comes to social media and knowing all of the mechanics of it. But I'll put my clinical hat on as, I generally tell friends of mine who are parents of Black children, or even my son, when a lot of that stuff was, some of the worst media portrayals, George Floyd, is like, don't watch it. You have to limit your exposure. Social media can be a source of trauma. And so that is what Diane Hughes would refer to as being directive. It's, is that you have a specific directive you give your child as a preemptive or in the moment about like, don't do this, don't do that. And then also exposing them to positive media, Black children's books, so on and so forth, is that the parent is being intentional about how they're directing that behavior. And that you wouldn't measure that as a separate construct. It would just be part and parcel of how you'd parent. Does that answer the question? Yes. Okay.
A question for anyone. It's not really a science question. It's more a question about Rob's legacy. And I was just thinking about what Tiffany was talking about in terms of some of the things that he said to us that we all kind of remember. And I just wondered, how has his mentoring kind of influenced your own mentoring style of grad students or undergraduates? And how do you think about that?
So I'll say one thing that immediately comes to mind for me. I mean, I could go on for a while. There's been a clear relation in things that Rob did and how I mentored my students. But one of the things my students always talk about is like when it was time for their talks at conferences, how we would go through meticulously like every slide. How we would be in the psychology building at UNC until all hours of the night, going through until those slides were just right. And that was something that Rob did when I was a student and that many of us can remember. And so that's one direct instance of how it showed up for my students.
One quick anecdote. So I didn't mention, I'm part of the OG. I trained with Robert when he was at Virginia Wahoo. And
wow.
See, there's other good universities out there. And Robert was the first one in the department to use PowerPoint. Remember that? So like this was in the 90s. Yeah, like so not only was he go through in the font, and see this was before there was transparencies, right? And so like you couldn't travel to the conference and just edit until the night before. You had to have your transparencies ready. And so he would go through and we'd practice in the labs like the font not right. You had to reprint those transparencies. But at the second Black graduate conference in psychology was when we rolled out the PowerPoint. And that was 1995. So, the projector, yes.
Oh, I remember that.
So I don't have a specific example. I shared my nuggets with you earlier, but I do pause to ask myself sometimes when I'm working with my students, what would Rob do? And that happens quite often. So it's more of a philosophy than a specific practice.
I'll add that Rob has influenced students I recruit. And so I joined the faculty at NC State last year. Before that, I had been at Rutgers University, traditional social psych program. And some of the conversations when it came time to recruit is that, I'm not looking at a student if they haven't published before, and I take a different approach. I remember Rob saying he would prefer to have a student who works hard and had balance in their lives than a student who had a 4.0 GPA in undergrad and didn't do anything else in their lives. And so I carry that lens, or I take that perspective when I'm trying to recruit students, or when students want to be recruited also, right?
I would say for me, it was really about, Rob would push me on my thoughts, because again, I don't think he was really a believer in what I was doing. So I think but in some ways it's been helpful, because I push my students too. I mean, I ask them to really I force them to think through what they're trying to test and justifying what they're doing in a way that I probably wouldn't if Rob hadn't done that for me. I think, he definitely pushed me in ways that at the time, I wasn't happy about. But when you're little, you don't understand. When you get older, you see things differently. So I definitely appreciate that, and I have incorporated that in how I mentor my students. I really gently push them, and then you see them kind of wrestling with an idea, and then all of a sudden it all makes sense for them, and it's rewarding. So I appreciate that.
I'll also add, I was telling Amber and Felicia earlier, when I'm talking to my students about their work, I'm often using Rob's question, what is your theoretical framework?
Nothing that comes to mind for me.
I think because you had another, they just let because you had another.
This isn't a funny one. It's just, it's true to some of these examples, saying things that Rob said to us and catching yourself saying them to your students as well. So one of the things I really appreciate about Rob as a mentor is he was like, look, at the end of the day, you have to make a decision for your life. This is going to be your life. Rob's goal was never to make carbon copies of himself. He was always about, I'm going to present the options, here's what I know best, but I want you to make the decision. You're going to be the one who's going to have to live your life with whatever decision you make. So that is something that I know my students appreciate about me, and whenever they're, lamenting, I've had many students come in saying, I'm not interested in academia, and I'm like, that's cool, you don't need to be. They have ended up going into academia. But I remember sort of saying to them, look, my mentor told me, this is your decision. It's not about trying to do what's going to make me happy. You're the one who has to be happy with the decision.
One thing I'd say is I don't remember ever having a feeling that I was working for Rob when I was a student, and it was always that we were working together, I was working with Rob, and that's something that I think I carry forward. In fact, I always pause when I'm about to say my student, because I don't own that student. The student has made a choice to come and work with me, and so I hope that's something that I do effectively.
Sad that the mentorship doesn't end, right? So, even as we're, sort of considering career decisions, like, should I be department chair? What should I do about this? I still ask Rob, right? Even as a full professor, and, it's a very accomplished panel, and we all still go to him. And I think that speaks volumes about his generosity and the wisdom that he has to share. So I just wanted to add that.
Yes, okay. So the thing that is striking to me about this incredible panel is the diversity of the types of topics, your background and training. So we have clinical psychologists, community psychologists, social psychologists, developmental psychologists, folks in public health, folks saying, all kinds of outcome variables using all kinds of different methods. And so I just wonder about your experiences of working with just one Robert Sellers and how does one person sort of spur that sort of intellectual diversity?
And I've been asked to repeat the questions for the people watching online. So the question is, given that this panel has wound up in many different fields of psychology and beyond, like public health, how do you all trace that back to work with one advisor?
That's a really great question. As I was reflecting on everyone's responses here, like Daryl, like I have not met you, and Lori, I'm fans of both of your work, and that's nice to actually make the in-person connection. When I think about like the stories that I hear in the family that's in this room, like Robert is the kind of mentor who is like an outstanding scholar and an outstanding person. And when I talk with, he's putting his head down like, oh, shucks. Like, that's part of for the people watching online, that's part of the humility is never getting so far ahead of your skis to remember that we're all human and none of us are perfect. We're just trying to do good work. And that's the piece for me that I've carried into different professional spaces. And those folks who know me here, well, I've had some like rough times in higher ed. I've almost left like 3 or 4 times. This is like post tenure. I was like, I'm out. But what drew me back was still a passion for the work, and also knowing that I had, and I got to look at you and say, outstanding training. And whatever microaggressions and, gobbledygook and garbage came for me, I had my laptop, my printer, my library card, and my mind. And when everything else was stripped away, it was that training at UVA that got me through and persisted. And to me, that's universal, is that you can go into any space and your confidence, like the optimism that comes from being confident, it is hard to take some of this incoming. But what I didn't have when I was your student was my own confidence. That didn't come until my 30s, but it all meshed with what had been poured into me in my 20s as a student. And so now I'm rock solid. Ain't nobody gonna take that from me.
So I can speak on this quickly. I think for me, I talked a little bit about some of the psychophysiology work that was not a part of my graduate training. One of the things that I've always admired about Rob that we can all relate to is he's always looking to open the door and create opportunities for his students, his trainees, so on and so forth. So I had no vision in my mind that I would do a postdoc in psychophys training, but Rob introduced the idea and said, what do you think about this? It was a week before the NSF postdoc application was due. And Rob was like, let me talk to Jules and let's see if we can make this happen. And it ended up happening, and it changed the trajectory of the work that I did. So how I have ended up in kind of these different things, public health, psychophys, cardiovascular health, is because Rob encouraged me to think outside the box. What about this? I think I kind of thought like traditional, like is this, and he really helped me to think about other possibilities outside the traditional.
Patricia Coleman Burns. This is an optic here that I think is amazing. And probably the only thing is if you were up there, we could get a picture of that. But So my question, as Rob knows, always is, what difference does this work make? What difference does diversity, equity, and inclusion work? And what Rob has done, and what I want to ask you to start thinking about, whoever responds, is how does this continue? Because what this reminds me of is all the scholarship and the knowledge that has been created over Rob's tenure, and how the connection between the scholarship and the research and what's going on in our world today and all the mental health issues, and how do we make that connection between the work that you're doing and where we need to go. I was and this is a long question, forgive me. I was in a space with James Clyburn, who is the 9th elected Black congressman out of South Carolina. And he said there's almost 100 years between him, number 9, and the previous 8, because of the end of Reconstruction, because of the rise of racism and white supremacy. And so I'm asking you to sort of, I don't know, just share 2 things. How do we make this connection between the scholarship and the science with equipping our young folk and all of us to endure and to move this country forward? And secondly, how do we make sure that there's not another 100 years between what we're doing here, and you've seen the articles, and the desire to squash this? Can you talk about that, please?
And I'll just sum that up for people watching online, and forgive me, this is super brief, but could you talk about what cumulative difference this work has made, especially for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and what are the ways that we can continue it into the future, given all the obstacles that this work has faced and is facing right now?
I'll weigh in because I grew up in Atlanta in John Lewis's district, and the further I get away from my youth, and I think about the fact that the MLK holiday was legalized when I was in high school. I used to march in those parades. And when I think about civil rights activism, because my research is my civil rights, I don't do a lot of marching. It's just not my thing. But my research, my training, the way that I mentor my faculty and my students, that's my activism. And so I think one part of this is like you pick your lane and you work that lane. We cannot do it, battle it on all fronts. Educating our students about it. So that's the first thing, is that as long as they don't actually know the history and know the knowledge, then of course they'll be positioned to undermine the legacy. And I don't know all of what's happening here on Michigan's campus, but I know it is one of many epicenters in the battle to dismantle DEI. And I think it's literally because of the robust nature of the work that's happened here at Michigan and other places around the country. It's because the scholarship is so strong that's why they're attacking it in these other ways. It's that, so they never come for the actual scholarship because the evidence is the evidence. And so and this is, again, is going back to Robert, when you know the truth of it, like, you don't have to really be scared. That what I do know is that if we cede the lane, it will be taken back. And so the lesson of, to me, the 2020s and beyond is that whatever gains we get, we have to stay vigilant to protect them with every successive generation. And we have to teach our young people through racial socialization or other means what that legacy actually means. And I think in the past 20 years or so, we just didn't think we would be back here in this moment. But that's the lesson, is that we are always going to be in this moment. And so keep doing what you feel is your thing. If you want to march, march. But pick your lane, and don't feel guilty about not being able to do it all, because we're all human. And that's how I make my peace with it.
I'll just say in my talk I was running long, and I didn't get to mention a couple of things, but my line of research on Latinx youth and that community has been going on, all the time that I've been in Atlanta since '97. And I'll tell you, recruiting Latinx students in Atlanta isn't the easiest thing to do. So what I was going to end up talking about, I'm going to slip it in now, was two students who worked with me, not my students, but two students who worked with me that had some ideas of work that they wanted to do around racial discrimination, ethnic racial identity, and civic action. And they designed their study and have done some really great work with that. And I get to put my name on it too, because I've worked with them. But that whole thing of letting students, encouraging students to follow their ideas and take them to fruition, I think has been one of the ways that I feel like I've contributed to that, and I hope so.
I don't have an answer, but I do want to make a comment. So I am currently working on my tenure materials, and it does weigh very heavily on me, particularly, so I'm at NC State University, which is part of the UNC system, and so they've gotten rid of all DEI programs, and those funds have been reallocated and gone to public safety. So it's very, very challenging, and I'm still trying to figure out what is the answer to the question, but also how do I keep moving forward so that my tenure case is a slam dunk. And I think part of what I need to do, which is somewhat similar to what you noted, Mia, is to make sure that I continue to be in spaces like this where I can continue to be re-energized and feed my soul. I try to remember the saying, rest is resistance. But I think also like being in these kinds of spaces will allow me to continue fighting and making sure that I reach the success that I need to reach so that I can then bring people with me, lifting as we climb, I know is one thing I've heard you say, Rob. So that's my comment, but I don't have a clear answer. It's a challenge and something that I'm grappling with myself.
I guess one thing that I think about, when thinking about my work, and, we've all been trained to do rigorous work, but going back to the so what question, right? And so, why do we do this work? And what relevance does it have in people's lives, right? And so that's something that I come back to. I go dig deep and then I come back out, right? What's the big picture? Why does this matter? Why are we doing this? And I think that doing that translational work, right? So taking our science, but also doing the translation is an important part of sort of underscoring the relevance of the work. So coming back to the why and the so what, for me, has helped me sort of bridge sort of the gap between the science and the application and relevance.
I think I would add two things. So I'm thinking about the translation piece. So I agree that that's important. And there were early parts of my career where I would think, okay, so I've showed that racial socialization buffers, it's a protective factor. That's nice. Does that really make an impact, publishing the study, so on and so forth. And there are times where I really question that. When I look at the generation of scholars who has come after me and the work that they have done, I immediately, all those concerns I have about whether the work was important kind of go away. People like Rihanna Anderson, for example, have developed racial socialization interventions and work with Howard and other people, and they credit the work that was done as a graduate student, which at the time I'm thinking, okay, this is just a study, but they took a seed and they ran with it. So I think for me, knowing that we got to get more people, students in who have their own ideas or who are going to innovate on some of the basic research. The other thought I had, Reverend Burns, is that we need to challenge and push, right? I remember when I was at UNC, there were students that wouldn't get the time of day. People were looking at me like I'm crazy. Like, why would you take that student? They would, I question some of the students that I would select and say, I think this is going to be a great student. And I had to push against that and say, you know what, here's why I think this is a talented student, and you know what, I don't care if you don't think that this is not. So pushing, one of the things that many people have said before me is that we do a lot of complaining, right, about how tough it is and how things are. One of the things I really admire about Robert Sellers is he's a strategist. He's always thinking about what is the strategy that we need to do to solve the problem. So, okay, we can complain about what the problem is, but how do we think about the strategy that's necessary to get to the next step? I think those are some things.
We have about 5 minutes left, so I want to, as the moderator, take those to do a little summarizing up and concluding before we get to lunch. First thing I want to talk about is some themes that I heard in this panel, and I was taking notes while you were talking, and now I look at them and they kind of seem obvious to me, but they seem obvious because of the work that Rob and all of you have done. And I assure you that 30 years ago, if you read the literature in psychology, these things would not be obvious. So the first is that the racism and discrimination of today, so some people might want to argue we don't have racism and discrimination today, but we see that the racism and discrimination of today does real harm, and it's lasting harm. It contributes to stress, depression, problem behavior for teens. It causes harm at the biological level. Sometimes we hear people talk about it getting under the skin. So we see that harm is being documented, not only that it exists, but the strength and the magnitude in all the places where it's playing out. But what we also hear in this research is that this isn't just about vulnerability, it's also about resilience. And we see this through the way this work focuses on Black people as individuals. Primarily that's through Rob's longstanding interest in identity. We do so much work on identity now. You might think, of course, when we talk about race, we talk about identity. But I can't emphasize enough what a shift that has been in the literature and psychology of moving from thinking about being African American, being a person of color as an ascribed status that kind of sets you up for stigma and discrimination, but it's something that individuals actively engage with and explore and make sense of for themselves. And that way it's very humanizing, this line of research. Through this, they build that resilience. And if you do your work on racial comparisons, and even today, psychologists are getting told by reviewers, where's your white comparison group? If you do that work through comparisons, you are never going to understand this, right? You only see this by looking at within group variability. The third thing I notice here is that doing that work puts people into the context where they live their lives. And if you know about the history of personality psychology, which is the area where Rob and I were trained, I didn't understand this when I went into it. Personality psychologists is where the eugenicists lived. It's where the people who were focused on IQ and documenting racial inferiority lived. What this work does is it not only humanizes people of color by thinking of them as individuals, but it puts them into context where we can see how their lives are lived. And within our own psychology department, we renamed the area of personality to personality and social context. And that was under Rob's leadership. I don't think everyone understands what an act of anti-racism that was, okay? So in this work, we see Black people in their schools, in their friendship networks, And in these contexts, we see how their experience of identity is not static. It's changing across situations. We're thinking about salience, how it's fluid, dynamic. It's a function of what people experience, how they live their lives, and how they make sense of it. So we see in this work people of color, Black people, African Americans, actively navigating these contexts. And I was really struck, maybe because it was the first talk, Dr. Bynum Smith said, parents are the first teachers, but students are not tabula rasa. They have temperament, they have their own beliefs. We saw in Dr. Yip's work, they're making sense of this. And as they do that, they're developing strategies to cope with racism. So even as we're focusing on racism, this line of work helps us see people of color, Black people, not just as victims, as people, we talked about Rob being strategic, but we also saw Black people being strategic in their own lives to navigate this. So that's what I saw in the research. Now I just want to say a few things about the words of wisdom we heard from Rob. Okay, we heard a lot of it. I'm going to say what stood out to me as kind of golden nuggets. The first thing is Rob is always pushing us to name our assumptions. What's your theoretical context? But also to check our assumptions, right? Understanding a group requires being open to the unexpected. I'm trying not to get on my own hobby horse, but we can't do that if we must pre-register our studies, right? If we have to say what we expect to find before we do them, we can't do that, but that's for another day. So checking your assumptions also means thinking really hard and rigorously about conceptualization and measurement. I don't know how many committees I've been on with Rob where he really pushes people on that. And not only that, what are the mechanisms? Why are these variables going together? How do we get there? I'm skeptical of using this term rigor because it's so often used in an exclusionary way, but I'm comfortable using it here because we're naming what rigor is, right? We're talking about understanding what we're bringing to the table and thinking about that rigorously and skeptically, which brings us to the next thing. An advisor like Rob brings a skepticism, right? We need advisors that push us. That makes us better. That makes our work better. We also heard people talk about Rob inspired them or taught them not to do studies for study's sake. And I would like to pair that up with something Dr. Yip said. So get that work out there, right? She said nobody's going to tenure your hard drive. But the implication of that is when it's sitting on your hard drive, it is not changing the world, right? So we're not doing this for its own sake. We got to get it out there. And then the last thing I want to say is I want to remind everybody mentoring is teaching. And I think we heard some amazing things about Rob as a teacher. We heard about the ways that he mentors the whole person. We heard how these full professors, department chairs are still turning to Rob for advice now, and they know that he will be there because he's invested in them as whole people. Dr. Hoggard said, Rob taught me how to think, and that, as a teacher myself, just gave me chills. But we also heard that he taught us how to be collaborators and how to be a mentor. And then finally, I think Dr. Noblet said this better than anyone, and I think it's the theme for today, his giving knows no end. Okay, so this was beautiful. Thank you all. Thank you for the work you do. Thank you for being here today.